tonight, this isn't about changing who you are. This is about helping you become who you are. And to give you an example of that, in 1974, President Gerald Ford was President of the United States. After he wasn't elected, he was just standing in that line, and he was appointed to be president. And in 1984, 10 years later, right before the Republican National Convention, he was going to give a speech. And he was in the desert and came into town, and I had been involved in the Republican Party, counseling politicians and polishing them in their speeches, etc. So they asked me to work with President Ford in preparing him for his speech at the Republican Convention. So a friend of mine named Don Penny, who was a writer for Reagan and a communications expert, called me and says, President's coming in from the desert, he's going to be at Fox, we've got his speech, we're going to put cameras up, we're going to monitor him, you know, he needs some work, we've got to get him ready for this thing. So he and I spent the afternoon at 20th Century Fox with a room similar to this with the podium and his speech where he was practicing the speech he was going to give at the convention. And of course, when you work with people like that, you defer to him. I mean, he had been President of the United States, and you walk lightly when you give these people advice, but he needed some help. One of his lawsuits wasn't public speaking. And he had an important message to make. And as we were practicing and emphasis here and the look there, etc., he was struggling throughout the day with it. So, and he knew it. And mid-afternoon, he calls Don and I over and he says, guys, he said, listen, I'm working on this thing. I'm having a little problems with the direction that you're giving me. And he says, Don, I know that you and Larry have worked with President Reagan and have done a great job with him, etc. But I'm not doing it. And Don says, well, that's true, Mr. President. He says, you know, President Reagan is, he's a communicator. You know, he's a thoroughbred. You know, he prances out on that racetrack and he holds his head up high and he speaks directly and he prances around and he performs. And he's great. And President Ford thought about it for a second and he says, well, he says, maybe the problem we're having is I'm not a racehorse. I'm a mule in a field pulling a plow. So maybe instead of trying to make me a racehorse, make me the best mule who ever stood in the field and pulled a plow. And I knew that moment I was standing in front of a man who knew who he was. A man who had, because of that attitude, worked his way up the ranks in Congress, had the respect of the body of Congress to the job that he got, and a man who probably, because of the soundbite society we live in, we would have never elected. But because of the time of our country, he was the man, and the right man for the job. So here's a man who rose to power because he knew who he wasn't and he knew who he was. And I tell you that because the first step to what we're going to talk about tonight, you've got to know who you are. And not feel bad that you're not somebody else. Because if you're going to try to imitate somebody else, you're never going to be good as that person. You're going to be a derivative version of that person. But what nobody can do other than you is be you. So, tonight, I want each of you to embrace you. And then we're going to take inventory of you. And then we're going to figure out how to fulfill the potential of who that person is.